The best example I have is Nelson Mandela and Leon Sullivan. How many of you ever heard of Nelson Mandela? Yeah, everybody heard of Nelson. How many of you heard of Leon Sullivan? Nobody heard of Leon Sullivan? Leon Sullivan, remember what I told you about shoulders that you walk on? There's a proverb that talks about we all enjoy the shade of trees we never planted. We drink from wells we never dug. You're drinking from Leon Sullivan's well, and you don't even know the man. Leon Sullivan was a guy who, this is a story about two people. Nelson Mandela, so Nelson Mandela was this guy in South Africa. The apartheid was happening in South Africa. It was just bugging him. He just thought that this was horrible. And he just fought against it, and they put him in jail. 27 years, he was stuck in jail on Robben Island. And they used to do mean things to him, Neil. They put him down in solitary confinement. 1 hour a day could he come out of solitary confinement. And while they had him in there, they said, all you have to do is denounce the ANC, the African National Congress, and we'll let you go. But he wouldn't do it. And they used to do stuff. They'd play music in his cell. Nelson, Nelson, please, Nelson. It was his mother's voice. I need you, Nelson, please. Because his mother was sick. I am sick and I need you. And he would just cry in his cell. I talked to him when I was over in South Africa. He told how he just took the sheet and he put the sheet in his mouth so that they wouldn't hear him cry. They would do stuff like leave the cell of the deal open. Hey, he'd go to the door. Hey, you guys left the door open, because what they wanted him to do is to walk out. If he walked out, they were going to kill him and say, he tried to escape. This is before cell phones, for all you millennials in the room. There was no cell phone, so they were going to shoot him if he walked out the door. But he would go to the door. Hey, you guys left the cell open. Somebody better come shut the door, And they do these kind of things to try and drive him crazy. But he would not denounce the African National Congress and the armed struggle that these guys have. That's Nelson Mandela. Put a pin right there, Nelson Mandela. Let's go to Leon Sullivan. Leon Sullivan was the first African American on a major corporate board. He was the corporate board of General Motors. Okay? And back in the 60s and 70s, I mean, you guys, I know you can't remember that, but in the 60s and 70s, old timers like me, I was kind of a Stokely Carmichael guy. I was like, let's burn some stuff up. I wasn't doing the Martin Luther King, let's march all nice. And, it's like I was more radical than that. And so I wasn't always wearing a suit now. And so when we got to that point, I heard about Leon Sullivan. I was like, he's probably an Uncle Tom, sitting up there on a corporate board. What could he be doing? He ought to be out here in the struggle. So fast forward 30 years later, I'm going over to Zimbabwe for a trade mission. Leon Sullivan's on the plane. Dr. Sullivan's sitting here. We're sitting on the tarmac. Dr. Sullivan tells this story about Nelson Mandela. And he said that when he got ready to go over to South Africa, he gets on a plane and he flies over on the General Motors plane. Because at that time, colleges were disinvesting from South Africa, governments were disinvesting, and people were trying to get people to disinvest their money out of South Africa. And General Motors, Leon Sullivan wanted General Motors to do the same. They said, no, Leon, we can't. We got billions of dollars in, and this is in the 70s. We got billions of dollars in investment. We can't divest from there. We can't. You don't understand. We're making progress. He said, you ain't making no progress. We going out there. I didn't know this. I thought this was Uncle Tom. He gets to the deal. They said, come on, we'll show you. They get on the corporate jet. They fly over to Johannesburg. They walk around the plant. And in the plant, Dr. Sullivan said you had white people sitting together with black people. You had a daycare where little black kids were playing with little white kids. And the General Motors CEO said, I told you, Leon, things are changing. He was like, I thought, they told me that apartheid, times are changing, Leon. So he starts going back. He said, maybe I was wrong. So they're cutting through the airport. They're going back to get on their jet. They're going through the airport. And he said he saw a guy up on the second floor as he was walking through, and he made a move. Neil, he made a move, and he said he knew something was wrong. And the next step he took, a guy put a gun in his face and said, you, hold it right there. Get out of line. And he said, but what? What did I do? He said, just get out of line. And so the white guy that's the CEO General Motors said, oh, you don't understand. He's with us. He's going to vouch for him. He said, you don't say nothing to me, Kappa boy, which means the N-word in Afrikaans. You Kappa lover. Get out of line too. So he takes the chairman of General Motors, moves him out of line too. He says, I need you to strip. He said, just strip? But why? What have I done? He said, just strip. Little young boy makes him strip. Dr. Sullivan looks up at him, the guy that's up in the top, and he starts taking his clothes off. Now, this ain't like TSA where you can go behind the deal and they'll wand you down and pat you down. They made him take his clothes off right out there in front of everybody. Dr. Sullivan got all the way down to his drawers, and the boss upstairs called him and said, tell him to take those off too. And so the guy, now he's shaking. Now he's shaking. He says, I'm sorry, sir. He says, I'm sorry, sir, my boss. Because see, Dr. King said, when you have undue suffering, it can be redemptive. So the undue suffering that you went redeems the evil person's soul. Dr. Sullivan hadn't yelled at the guy. He didn't cuss at him. He didn't try to fight him. He took his clothes off. He was down to his drawers. And when this guy said that, now the kid is saying, I'm so sorry, sir, that I have to do this, but my boss told me that I have to do this. Dr. Sullivan said, you go ahead and you do to me what you must do to me. Because when I get back to my country, the United States of America, I am going to do to your country what I must do to your country. He took his drawers and he pulled them down, and he looked up at the guy. See, because the guy didn't want to see his private, what the guy wanted to see is his dignity going. And Dr. Sullivan wouldn't give him his dignity. He took his clothes and he put them in his arm and he walked through the airport naked so that they would have to look at him in all of his majesty. It was him. He decided how he would be looked at. Leon Sullivan. And he went back and he gets on the plane of the chairman of the General Motors board, and all of the white guys on the plane, you talk to him, because he didn't say a word. You talk to him. You the CEO. I'm just the VP. You know, he's on our board. He's on the board of directors. And so he's sitting there. Finally, the chairman speaks. So Dr. Sullivan hadn't said a word. Plane takes off. He hadn't said a word. Finally, the chairman says, Leon, I'm so sorry. I thought that things had changed. He said, no, they changed inside of the company. But they haven't changed in South Africa, where the majority of Africans live in this country. He said, I don't know. What do you want me to do? He said, I want you to get on that phone, and I want you to call the President of the United States, as I've seen you do on so many occasions. And I want you to tell him that General Motors is divesting everything that it has out of South Africa immediately. If you don't, I'm resigning from the board, calling a press conference and telling every black person in America, do not buy another General Motors car. I was like, you did that, Dr. Sullivan? Here I'm like thinking he's like for 30 years at Uncle Tom. Here's a guy that said, okay, Nelson Mandela, hold it. Back to him. Remember, we had him on hold. When Leon Sullivan got done putting the political pressure on, Nelson Mandela was freed from Robben Island, walked out because he had said before he started, he said, I'm going to look and focus my eyes on that door, and that door is going to open for me one day. And it's going to open without me having to touch it, without me having to fire a shot, without me having to tackle a guard, without me having to beat anybody up. It's going to open. And every day he would just, because remember, he was in there for 23 hours a day. He'd just stare at that door. Keep his mind, he'd go through all of the books that he'd read, the newspapers that he'd read. He'd just stare at that door. The day that they came and unlocked his door, when the boycott had worked, and they opened the door, Nelson Mandela walked out free that night. I'll never forget when he threw his hand up and said, I'm free. And he walked out, him and Winnie. It just goes to show you what you can do in corporate America. This was a corporate America deal that happened. Leon Sullivan sat in corporate America. He made a decision that as opposed to staying on the board of General Motors, making those big fat salaries they was making, being on the board, he decided, I'll take the money and throw that away because it's more important for me to get these people in South Africa free and to be able to live like first-class citizens. So remember what I said. What I said to start this is, if you make a decision that I just can't take this anymore, it goes against everything I believe in. You know, I got to stay true to myself. Well, you got to stay true to yourself. Make sure whatever you're staying true to is of value enough, it means enough to you that it's worth putting your life on the line. As Dr. King said, a man who has nothing worth dying for has a life that's not worth living. Okay? So